Now that you've read chapter 1, I'd like to just point out a few things in the chapter that I would like you to consider in more depth. For instance, if we look at our definition of interpersonal communication, we see it starts off by saying it's a complex process. And I want that to kind of stick in your mind a little bit. I want you to think of communication as a complex process. I think if we think about it as something that's complex, that we are more likely to be more sensitive to the communication around us, more alert about it, and we'll be more inclined to think a little bit more about our communication. And that's kind of what we're doing in this class. We're kind of highlighting our communication. As you go through your day, you might find that you're noticing things about your communication with others more than you did prior. And that's the whole idea, to put it into the foreground, to to highlight it for us so that we can look at it more closely. So I would like you to think about communication as a complex process. If we look at a traditional model of communication, it looks sort of like this. It's a very simplistic view of a sender, a receiver. There's a channel, that's the means through which we're communicating. We communicate a message. And then when we are done communicating the message from the sender to the receiver then feeds back, gives feedback to the sender. And the process the sender goes through of deciding what message to send is called encoding. And the process the receiver goes through after he or she receives the message and interprets it is called decoding. So this is a good place to start to think about how communication works, but I would like you to think about it as being a little bit more complex than this. Your book offers this sort of model to look at, and it is, as you can see, a more complex model. But we still have the same basic elements. Andy's our sender, Taylor's our receiver, and they are in an interaction communicating with one another. What this model, though, does is help us think about all the things that are involved in that process. So although Andy is encoding a message and sending it to Taylor, there's a lot that goes into that encoding. Andy is thinking about past experiences that he's had with other people, including Taylor, and deciding what kinds of messages worked well for him. That's where it says on here where he's consulting repository scripts. Right here. He is consulting past things that have happened, and this is happening, of course, in a split second. And then the same thing happens as Taylor is decoding the message. She's also thinking about past experiences with Andy and other people, and thinking about how those can help her interpret this message. But there's also this feeling that there will be a future interaction as well. We just never know about the future interactions we're going to have with people. Sometimes we know we're going to have future interactions, and sometimes we're not sure. But that idea that there could be future interaction kind of impacts the way that we encode and decode too. So we have this historical context that we're interpreting messages in, but we also have a future context we're thinking about as we're in interaction with someone else. So there's a lot of things going on here. And in the middle, they show this section called shared experience. So the degree to which Andy and Taylor have some things in common, there's a space there in which the messages will probably be pretty clear. But there's a lot of space where they don't have shared experiences and they don't have the same scripts they're using in their minds to either encode or decode. And so in this area, some of the communication could be kind of distorted. It could be interpreted in ways in which either Andy or Taylor don't mean it to be interpreted. So as you can see, this model helps us think about it as a very, very complex process. And I kind of would like you to have that in your mind too, that it's complex. It's like I said, I think then that we'll be more sensitive to the whole process. If we think it's easy, we won't think very much about our communication. But if we think it's hard, maybe we'll think twice about it. There are some other things we have to keep in mind in interpersonal communication, especially in modern times. It's not just about you and another person in a room talking to each other. It's not even about you and another person on the telephone talking to each other. It's more complicated than that, and social media brings new context to the interpersonal communication situation. So we all interact on social media, we use technology, and that brings a whole other element to our interpersonal communication and to our relationships. Some traits of social media that we should consider are that, when we're on email or we're on Twitter or we're looking at Facebook, these are all ways that we're going to socially interact with people. Now, it takes time to do all of these things, and people have a little bit more time to think about what they would like to say if they would like to take that time. But it also lacks social cues, meaning that when you can't see the person, you can't see the nonverbal, you may not know exactly how to interpret the message. Although we've come up with a lot of ways to put social cues into our messages, and we know that we all use little smiley faces or other kinds of shorthand kind of language to use when we're interacting with people in social media, so that they hopefully get the nonverbal cues, they get the correct interpretation of what we're saying. Another factor is that when we're usually talking to another person, that's most of the time not being taped or recorded. But when we are involved in social media and we're interacting with somebody else, that is stored and can be replicated and is saved and can come back to bite you, and we can see exactly the words that you used, and there can be no mistake about it. So that is a different element to our relationships when we're interacting through social media. So social media is a big thing to consider in our interpersonal relationships. I mean, it's part of our relationships now. Another thing that is a part of our relationship more than ever in the past is the idea of diversity. There's a lot of diversity, of course, in the world, and the world is getting smaller and smaller. So we have to take this diversity into consideration more and more if we want to have effective communication with others. We are going to be in interaction on a regular basis with people who are very different than us. We have to have some appreciation for those differences, some understanding of those differences, and some acknowledgement that our communication may be a little bit more difficult because of those differences. Doesn't mean we can't communicate well, just means that we may have to think more about that communication because of the great diversity in the world. And one of the most important ways that we are diverse is our culture. And once again, as the world gets smaller and smaller and we use social media more and more, we're going to be interacting with people from all different cultures. And culture is something that you are born into, so it impacts you greatly throughout your whole life. And it has a huge impact on the way that you communicate and on the way that you interpret what other people say to you. So again, we have to have a great appreciation for this as we interact with other people, that they may be of a different culture and have been socialized in a different way and may be interpreting our message in a certain way because of that. Now, to put all this in perspective, what we want to do in this course is become more competent communicators, of course, especially on a one-on-one basis. So we're talking about interpersonal communication, one-on-one, and trying to be more competent at this. What does competence mean? Well, we're talking about being more effective and more appropriate. Effective is about making sure that your message is communicated in the way that you meant it to be, and appropriate means that it's communicated in a way that it takes into consideration the diversity in the world and is an attempt not to offend people. So we're going to try to be effective and appropriate so that we can grow healthy relationships with other people. And we're going to do that by increasing our knowledge that we have about interpersonal communication. So we'll look at theories and see what we've learned through research. And then we'll work on our skills and try to increase the skills that we have. So we'll practice some things, we'll go out and observe some things and see if we can get better at being a communicator. And we also have to kind of increase our motivation. I mean, you have to want to be a better communicator. And hopefully just being in this class kind of heightens your awareness of the importance of communication, and you'll be motivated to perhaps change some ways you communicate with others and improve your own communication skills. So good luck, and let's go on and try to become more competent communicators.